"I should like to go shooting and see what the earth is like," sighed a young star. But the evening star knew that meant many dangers, for down there life was not so happy or serene as up in their lofty sphere. And she knew, too, that he would go his own way as youth always does, and she felt sorry, for she did not like to part with this bright little star. And so he went. That fine, crisp night the tiny star was seen to shoot right down to earth, and the light of his presence was no longer there. A hard frost was on the ground. The shops were shut, for it was Boxing Day. Those who were not on enjoyment bent were snugly quartered by their own fireside, with the firm conviction that nothing would tempt them away. Some, however, had business to attend to in spite of its being a holiday, and old Joshua was one of these. He was known as Old Joshua because his hair had turned prematurely white as the rime which had gathered on his shabby hat as he hurried along the murky, dimly lighted street which led to the great theatre. The wind had entered so unceremoniously that his thin coat was biting cold. The violin he carried was more carefully muffled up than he. 1, 2, 3, he counted as a neighboring clock began chiming. 4, 5, 6. He quickened his pace. He had to be in his place in the orchestra in extra good time, as it was the first night of the new pantomime. And before that he had some one coming to meet him at the back entrance. "I shall be there all in good time," he muttered. "By Jupiter," he explained, as he tripped and nearly fell over something that was lying straight in his path. Only when he stooped down did he discover that on the pavement lay a small child, all cold to the touch, with fair curls dishevelled and eyes wide open that seemed to see nothing. Old Joshua's heart filled with pity and indignation. "What a shame," he muttered, "to abandon such a treasure as this, and no one about who can help me." He looked anxiously around. No one was in sight, so he hurriedly went in search of a policeman. When he had succeeded in finding one, and two reached the spot together, a crowd had collected and was gazing wonderingly at the tiny phosphorate form. "Stand back there," commanded the man of law. The clock chimed the quarter hour. Old Joshua felt the cold no more. He was in a nervous heat at the delay. Nevertheless, he waited till a cab was hailed. Then the policeman tenderly lifted the helpless little creature into it, and the driver wrapped his rug around it. "To the hospital," directed the policeman, stepping aside, and the vehicle was driven smartly away. The crowd dispersed, and with it old Joshua as quickly as he could hurry through the throng. At the stage door he found his little Stella awaiting him with sparkling eyes in anticipation of her annual treat. "Daddy, you're late," she said, holding up a finger in mock gravity. Then she clapped her hands with delight at his arrival. Old Joshua would not distress her with the cause of his delay, so he only stooped and kissed her. "Give me your hand, old lady," he said, "and come along quickly. Through this door, that's right. Up you go. Don't step on my poor toes or push against me when we turn the corner more than you can help, or old Daddy Joshua and his fiddle might be a little out of tune." And laughing as they went, they climbed right up to the top back row of the vast empty theatre. There a smiling attendant welcomed her as quite an old little friend. And when he had seen his daughter raised up on a seat by means of a big hassock, old Joshua, with a nod of thanks, hastened below to join his comrades of the orchestra and help create the squeaky din which they called tuning up. At last the lights were turned up. An eager troop of pleasure-seekers tumbled into the gallery in a rush, and while Stella was looking around her, every available seat was quickly occupied. The other parts of the house were filling rapidly in more dignified style, and soon every place was tented in honor of the great Christmas pantomime. The large orchestra struck up, and when the overture was over, the gorgeously painted curtain slowly rose. Stella, perched up aloft, forgot where she was, and everything else in the world went straight out of her head as she gazed with rapture at the lovely scene that was peopled with fairies and goblins and wonderful beings disported themselves in a land that was all glitter and gold. And so the hours flew by in a wonder of loveliness, fairy story, and fun. "Ava bit o' orange, dearie?" asked the stout woman who was sitting next to her, but Stella was too engrossed to think about oranges or neighbors, nor even did she feel the light nudge that followed. The woman merely turned to her husband, smiled, and held her peace, while Stella threw back her head and shook with laughter, as the crown tickled Pantaloon with a poker that looked extremely red-hot. She wasn't a bit tired, and quite surprised to hear "God Save the King," and to find the whole beautiful show was already over like a dream. It had seemed to her as though it must go on forever. Flushed and excited, and a good deal jostled by the moving crowd, she made her way to the staircase in order to meet the motherly attendant on the next landing, who had promised to take her to her father at the stage door. Stella was walking down carefully step by step when two young men came roughly tearing past her. "Are you better?" "Talk to him tomorrow, dear," advised Nurse Evelyn. As she gazed at him, Stella thought she had never seen so beautiful a child. She stretched out her arm and took his tiny palm in hers. Then he turned his face toward her and smiled, confidently and trustingly, leaving his hand in hers. And thus, with love and pity in her heart, she fell fast asleep. And in the night she saw a wonderful thing. A moonbeam that seemed to come down into the room. The small hand in hers unloosed itself, and the boy arose looking gloriously beautiful. His eyes were shining, and he could see the bright light, and he began climbing up the beam so easily that it looked like gliding, so happily now that he could see his way and whither it was leading him. "Yes, dear," replied Nurse Evelyn gently. "Now don't think of him any more. Here's a pretty book with pictures." But Stella did think of him a great deal more. The little golden-haired boy occupied her thoughts more than anyone ever knew. And that night, and many other nights, when she looked upwards at the vast sky, so mysterious and serene, with its millions of stars, she would wonder and ponder. And there was always one particular little star that she loved best, and when she looked upon it, a sweetness would steal into her heart, and she would think of the gentle boy with the angel face, who had gone back to heaven, for she felt quite sure that he was there amongst them, and that he could see her, and that perhaps he loved her. And all to herself she called him little Starry, and she remembered him always.